was enough. You don't hear? Really? No. Could you make it a little louder, please? Hello? Is it okay?
Yeah.
It's okay? Thank you. This was something I was going to mention. The long list of David's accomplishments. We are both on a project of 4-volume history, literature, a world history, in Arabic, lawh, L-A, which means the tablet. And this was about 10 years ago in Stockholm, and we happened to be on the same panel. And we've been trying to get David here for a couple of years now. He's not as difficult to get as rediscovering the Epic of Gilgamesh, but almost as difficult. And finally, I'm very happy to have David among us tonight. I mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh because not only to emphasize that Damrosh is the leading world scholar on world literature, with a scope stretching from the oldest epic we know to the latest hip-hop text of the Lebanese-Canadian K-Maro, but also to indicate that his first scholarly interest revolved around our part of the world, ancient Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and biblical literature. His first book, The Narrative Covenant, Transformations of Genre in the Growth of Biblical Literature, 1987, brilliantly demonstrates the continuity between the Mesopotamian and biblical narrative, thus integrating the biblical narrative within its larger Near Eastern environment. If David Damrosh were a civil engineer, I'm sure he would have been busy building bridges. He does that not only across historical and geographical expansions, but also and especially across the divides that separate mentalities, traditions, and even colleagues. In his second book, We Scholars, Changing the Culture of the University, in 1995, he raises the problem of over-specialization and alienation among scholars. In this case, too, Damrosh wants to build bridges between them through bringing together people, quote, who are able to commit large projects by group work and by sharing their ideas with others, end of quote. His own projects are the best examples of such group works, initiating and editing collective works and anthologies. He has thus been active as founding general editor of the 6-volume Longman Anthology of World Literature, 2004, editor of Teaching World Literature, co-editor of the Princeton Source Book in Comparative Literature, and last but not least, founder and director of the Institute for World Literature. But maybe the most important contribution that Damrosh has made is his famous book, What is World Literature, in 2003, which has become a classic in the field. For Damrosh, world literature consists of all literary works that circulate beyond their culture of origin, either in translation or in their original language. At the same time, he is aware that any view of the world is a view from somewhere. So world literature is experienced very differently in different places. He is thus well aware of the local conditions of producing and reading what we call world literature. It does not necessarily denote a ready-made canon of works. It has very much to do with translation, circulation, and production, titles of the various sections he discusses and illustrates in his work. He stresses the idea that world literature is marked by two poles, the national point of origin and the international or global reception or audience, from where emerges the idea of localization of world literature. According to Damrosh, it is bad if world literature gets purely trapped in its moment of origin, or if it gets purely internationalized. In one of his many articles, Damrosh says, in its double and even multiple nature, literature provides a prime case of a simultaneous localization of the global and globalization of the local. His talk this evening may well shed light on what he means. His latest work, How to Read World Literature, How to Study Literature, is not addressed to specialists, but to the general readers interested in literature as well as undergraduate students. It is very accessible in introducing the readers to major works of world literature and to showing them how to read works and to encourage them to read and read and read. I wouldn't forget the Buried book, published just before that, the Buried book, The Loss and the Discovery of the Great Epic of Gilgamesh. Coming to the field with an astonishing range of languages and literary cultures, Damrosh is contagious in his passion about what he does. For the last 3 decades, he has been carrying the mission of comparative world literature, writing, teaching, and lecturing, preferring to discuss the most complicated questions of the field with very cogent arguments, clear language, and accessible style. He is a real pleasure to listen to and to read alone or with students. Reading his panel discussion with Beatrice Spivak, one can easily realize the difference in style and the care he takes to allow his readers and listeners to understand his views on the thorniest problems at hand. He teaches us that a real intellectual contribution does not have to be presented in a complicated way. This may also explain why his works are so popular among specialists as among undergraduate students. About his relation to teaching, Damrosh says, "To me, teaching is like a secular pulpit. I have a very evangelical sense of literature as a mode of experiencing the world as aesthetic pleasure that I love to communicate to students." Well, I hope he finds our present secular chapel suitable for communicating his love for experiencing the world as aesthetic and intellectual pleasure. I do not know what he is going to say in his lecture, but I'm sure he will try his magic at building a bridge between the local and the global, between Kipling's India and K-Maro's Montreal, and I wish him good luck. Please join me in welcoming David Damrosh.
So thank you so much. So that this is a little bit in the way. You can see me okay? I can move this. Well, I could talk at an angle like this. Okay. Perfect. Great. Well, I want to thank Assad warmly for that exceptionally challenging introduction to which I now have to attempt to live up. as well as thank also Nado Bisri for his kind welcome these last 2 days. I'm very honored to be here and helping to honor the memory of Anis Maksisi, such an important figure for the university as well as broader cultural life, and certainly builder of bridges in its own generation. Louder? Well, I'm always happy to hear my own voice. That's the subtext of most of what Assad was quoting. I love to hear myself speak. Like any preacher, I am the son of a preacher and grandson of a preacher also. And my father was an amateur organist, so I'm very happy to think in his context as well. So the general theme that I want to address is the question of the sort of politics of global English on the positive side, thinking about some of the ways that English becomes used in a post-colonial setting. It is often, concerns are often expressed, and with good reason, that the sort of spreading, especially American popular culture, English language can have an effect of flattening out local cultures around the world. And certainly in the colonial period, there was often a kind of imposition of an English canon, of English over almost a neglect of the local. And I think what's interesting now is to see how many creative artists around the world are using English or different forms of English in new ways. English is increasingly becoming not so much or simply a hegemonic language against local cultures, but when it's used creatively, more as a kind of resource for the local itself in multilingual settings, which is what I'll get to with K-Maro at the end. And also as a kind of transit language through which smaller linguistic groups can communicate to each other via this intermediate means. So we have a whole kind of shifting landscape of the politics of global English that I think reconfigures the older colonial relations in interesting ways. We can see this, for example, in a dictionary of Australian English from a couple of decades ago, compiled by Afroback Lauder, called Let's Talk Stroin. And what one has to realize is that Afroback Lauder himself is a pseudonym because the dictionary is combined in Afroback Lauder, so that's Afroback Lauder, who becomes the figure. And Afroback Lauder describes what inspired him to realize he needed a dictionary of Australian English, or Stroin, because it's not the same language as the Queen's English. And the particular inspiration was a report of a visiting British novelist coming to sign books in Sydney. It was recently reported that while English writer Monica Dickens was autographing copies of her latest book as they were being bought by members of the public in the Sydney shop, a woman handed her a copy and said, Emma Chiswick. Thinking this was the woman's name, Monica Dickens wrote to Emma Chiswick above her signature on the flyleaf. The purchaser, however, in a rather more positive voice, said, "No, Emma Chiswick!" Eventually it became clear that she had speaking Stroin, and had used the Stroin equivalent of the English phrase, "How much is it?" The misunderstanding was due to the fact that Miss Dickens had never been told that while Stroins are often able to understand and read English, they usually speak only Stroin. A wonderful send-up of the old colonial idea of the poor subaltern who may be able to barely understand English but can only speak their native language. And of course the joke here is as much on Monica Dickens, a very resonant name for a British novelist, because she doesn't understand the language that is being spoken to her, and she mistakenly believes that the consumer in Sydney really just wants the sort of honor and glory of the cultural capital of her name on the flyleaf, whereas the practical-minded Australian woman wants to know if it's worth her own capital to shell out for the book. Much more concrete, much less in love with the very idea of Britishness as itself a cultural value. And I thought this might be an interesting moment to start with in the AUB here. What is the relation of American English in terms of this older British colonial heritage of the greatness that was Dickens, let's say, And one of the things that's interesting in this vocabulary then that Arthur Blotter goes on to give, various definitions are used to sort of reflect on the imperial heritage of English and used as a kind of satire on Australian politics of the 60s when he wrote this. So there's Gloria Sarah Titch. Madam Titch has always been a great favorite of strong older statesmen, who often refer to her in their more exuberant quotations, e.g., "This is our glorious heritage! We must defend it with your last drop of blood." The classic politician, it's not their last drop of blood, we understand, it's your last drop of blood. And my favorite is Gunga Din, as in the phrase locked out, as in, "I'm Gunga Din! The door's locked!" So here we have this archetypal Kipling-esque figure of the colonial subaltern, so obedient that even as he's dying, he only hopes that his master has been properly served with water, and one of the more pathetic relics of the imperial English. And this made me think back to Kipling, because I think that Kipling is actually the first global author. And I'd be interested if you'd have other competitors for the honor. He doesn't have to be the first. I'd be happy to think who's earlier. But at least in the modern sense of an author who's writing for a global audience, self-consciously so. I can't think of anyone before him to this extent. That is already in his 20s, who was writing to be read on 4 or 5 continents, actually being published on 4 continents, thanks to the spread of global English. But what's interesting is that he goes very quickly from being a local Anglo-Indian writer to becoming a global writer. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So the early Dickens, and early really means like age 19 to 22, is a local writer. He is writing for the Civil and Military Gazette in Lahore. They start publishing his poems, like the departmental ditties, just to fill column space at the end. And in these stories, in the early poems, he assumes a very local audience. He has no idea he'll be read more than outside of Lahore. And so in a case like this, and we have one of his more embarrassing characters, Horichindal Mukherjee, who reappears in his novel Kim, first makes an appearance here in 1886. This is Kipling's first collecting of his poems. He's 21 or 22, and he publishes this at 21. Horichindal Mukherjee, pride of Beaubazar, owner of a native press, barrister at law, waited on the government with a claim to wear sabres by the bucketful, rifles by the pair. Noting 2 things of note. One, Kipling assumes we know where Beaubazar is in Calcutta. There's no explanation, we should know this. Second, the use of Anglo-Indian English, non-standard English, is mocking, patronizing, barrister at law, is really adapted from stage Irish at this point, I think. A drunken Irishman might pronounce barrister like that. And now we have a kind of political imperial worry. Here he wants to, he has a native press, that he's a lawyer, and he expects the government should give him weapons so he can sort of have sabers and rifles like the British. And the government foolishly is willing to do this. But the Indian government, always keen to please, also gave permission to horrid men like these. Yar Muhammad Yusuf Sai, down to Killer Steel, Chimbu Singh from Bikaner, Tantia the Gil. And so we have Kipling's famous love of different ethnicities now being turned in a kind of sinister direction with a special emphasis on Muslim names, you'll notice. Killer Khan, the Maharaji, Jawar Singh, the Sikh, Nubi Baksh Punjabi Jat, Abdul Huk Rafiq, he was a Wahhabi. Last little Mohalu took advantage of the act and took a Snyder too, the high-tech rifle of the day, the Snyder. So here we have Horichindal Mukherjee is a figure, sort of comic, but then you have these particularly Muslim Indians who you're really worried about. And of course, Kipling is writing this, he's born in 1865, just within the shadow of the so-called mutiny a few years earlier. So it's a very kind of eerie and anxious imperial damping down. What became of Mukherjee? Well, what happens in the middle of the poem, which I didn't give you, is apparently he's murdered for his weapons by these other locals. What became of Mukherjee, simply who can say? Yar Muhammad only grins in a nasty way. Jawar Singh is reticent, Chimbu Singh is mute, but the belts of all of them simply bulged with loot. What became of Mukherjee? Asked Muhammad Yar, prodding Shiva's sacred bull down the Bow Bazaar. Speak to Placid Louis Baksh, Western Land and Sea. Ask the Indian congressman. Only don't ask me. That's how the poem ends. Quite a creepy poem, not a very happy poem. Poem full of anxieties, even the idea of the Bow Bazaar, which is also where the British police station was located. Muhammad Yar is prodding Shiva's sacred bull right in front, so you get this sort of uncomfortable sense what sorts of, and Muhammad has Shiva's bull. There's this weird sort of intermixing of religions and what's going to happen here, you know. So this is the early Kipling. It was very local, very imperial, and his use of language is not yet very creative. But he goes global very fast. So he's born in Bombay, goes to England as a youth, as a kid, sent to school, comes back to Lahore in 1882. And just 4 years later, so he's 21, departmental ditties are published in Lahore and Calcutta. By 88, 2 years later, it's reprinted in London. And then his first collection of stories from the newspapers, Plain Tales from the Hill, is published simultaneously in Lahore, Calcutta, and London. By the next year, Plain Tales from the Hills is published in New York and Edinburgh, and gets its first German translation. By 1890, you have multiple editions of Kipling, India, England, USA. In USA alone, it's published in New York, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco. And that's a large distribution, very fast. By 91, 92, translated to German, Dutch, Danish, Russian, and probably other languages, just what's in the Harvard Library. So already by 65, 85, by the time he's 25 years old, 1890, he is being published all around the world. He knows it. He's become a global writer already in his mid-20s, which is why I say I can't think of any other of that level of success that young. Thanks to global English, the English Empire, and just because he hit it at the right way. Now, what's really interesting to me is that it radically changes how he writes, still in his mid-20s, because he now knows he's writing his local stories for a global audience. So we have the local already there, self-consciously. And you see him, if you look at his stories of these periods from about 22 to 25, he's inventing, in an unsystematic way, by the seat of his pants, all the strategies that every later writer will use of global English to mediate between a local language, local culture, and a worldwide culture. So interspersing Hindi, for example, in his English. He develops a whole series of strategies. Sometimes he will translate the word in parentheses after the original. Sometimes he will paraphrase it. Sometimes he will just give a calque, it's really an English term that must be based on a Hindi term. Sometimes he will leave the Hindi term untranslated, unexplained for its radical foreignness when he wants that, right? He'll use all of these, sometimes he'll italicize, sometimes he will not, depends on how much he wants to market, all of these things. And every writer after him, up to Salman Rushdie and beyond, have learned from this and adapted these strategies, these linguistic and sort of typographical strategies. And what's particularly interesting is that not only does he start to think globally, but he starts to really make advantage of the fact that he himself sees India with an England returned perspective, right? Because he goes to England, he comes back again, he's inside and outside, and this is nowhere better seen than in his novel Kim, with the 13-year-old Anglo-Irish, hero who clearly embodies lots of Kipling's own experience. Equally, what's interesting from this point of view to me is Horachandra Mukherjee becomes reinvented. We saw him in the departmental ditties as this very obnoxious, embarrassing character. And my friends in India still find Kim an impossible book to enjoy, among several reasons, because of the representation of Horachandra Mukherjee, who is deeply embarrassing, obnoxious, because I think they see him purely as the earlier Horachandra Mukherjee. But actually, what is interesting is that Kipling has Mukherjee, he creates a complicated character with Mukherjee, who actually performs the European stereotypes of the excitable Indian for his own purposes. So this is a higher level thing altogether. So what we have in the story of Kim, if you know it, or if you haven't read it recently, many of us read it in childhood and not since, so there's this kind of great game of the British Empire. and against particularly at this point Russian and French imperial forces. And Mukherjee and Kim work for the British secret sort of service of the day. And Mukherjee, who sort of guides Kim around for a good stretch and sort of instructs him. In this very interesting scene, he meets up with a pair of Russian and French spies, and part of one of the subplots of the novel is that Kim and Mukherjee have to find out what these guys are doing in northern, up in the Himalayas, and thwart them. And Mukherjee actually gets away their papers and their maps, so actually controlling the map is quite interesting. And he does it by performing babu myths, performing imperial oppression. And Oily, so he takes on a guise. He sees them coming, these foreigners. He knows he has to approach them. He thinks, well, how am I going to do it? And this is how he does it. And Oily, wet, but always smiling Bengali, talking the best of English with the vilest of phrases. And this is actually quite interesting because he's now doing this deliberately. Was ingratiating himself into stubborn, rather erratic foreigners, the spies. There's no need to feign madness. We're now actually doing interior kind of monologue of Hori Babu. The Babu had thought of another means of securing the welcome. He wrung out his wet clothes, slipped on his patent leather shoes, opened his blue and white umbrella, and with a mincing gait and a heart beating against his tonsils, appeared as, "Waiting for his Royal Highness, the Rajah of Rampur, gentlemen, what can I do for you, please?" He became thickly treasonous, and spoke in terms of sweeping indecency of the government, which had forced upon him a white man's education and neglected to supply him with a white man's salary. Any professor can relate to this. He babbled tales of oppression and wrong until tears ran down his cheeks for the miseries of his land. Then he staggered off, singing love songs of Lower Bengal. I love Lower, especially the Lower Bengal song, and collapsed upon a wet tree trunk. He completely fools the Russian and French spy. Never was so unfortunate a product of English rule and Indian run happily thrust upon natives. They're all just in that pattern, said one sportsman to the other in French. They're masquerading as sportsmen. They speak French, the diplomatic language, the rival diplomatic language to English. This is the Russian speaking the other French. When we get into it proper, thou wilt see. Decidedly, this fellow is an original, said the taller of the two foreigners. He is like the nightmare of a Viennese courier. There we have the Austro-Hungarian Empire being mocked. He represents in little India in transition, being monstrous hybridism of East and West. The Russian replied, "It is we who can deal with Orientals." This is in Kipling, 100 years before hybridism was a gleam in Homi Bhabha's eye. He is pro-hybridism. Who knew, right? And I don't think, the people who don't like Kipling because of his, white man's burden, so they're missing this whole strand in Kipling. Admittedly, the younger Kipling is more simply racist and imperialist. The older Kipling ossifies again. After about 1900, it becomes harder to read. But there's this amazing few years in his late 20s, a decade or so, which is his most creative decade, where he's doing much more complicated things than we might think. And I think that this is really, and we see even Hori Babu not only performing Babuness to actually get the better of the Europeans. Of course, Kipling's hybridism has limits. That is, Hori Babu will not get the better of any British, but he can get the better of a French and a Russian person. But that's Kipling's jingoism towards France and Russia. And we even have an interesting moment in which Hori uses English as a secret code. This is very interesting. He's instructing Kim on how to recognize each other and secret signs to use if they're meeting up on the road in disguise. Suppose we get him in a damn tight place. I am the fearful man, most fearful. But I tell you, I have been in damn tight places more than hairs on my head. You say, I am son of the charm. Very good. Kim says, I do not understand quite. We must not hear her talking English here. They're out in the middle of the bazaar. That is all right, said her. I am only Babu, showing off my English to you. Only Babu's talking this to show off, said Hori, flinging his shoulder cloth jauntily. And then what's really interesting, at this point he goes into almost perfect standard English. Right? As I was about to say, son of the charm means that you may be member of the Sat Bali, the Seven Brothers, which is Hindu and Tantric. It is properly supposed to be extinct society. I have written notes to show it is still extant. You see, it is all my invention. Very good. So this is really interesting. So Hori Babu is a highly self-aware person who uses English, who uses Babu-ness to fool the Russian and the French spy, and uses English as a secret code to communicate openly with Kim in the midst of the bazaar where all the enemies will just think, oh, it's English, and they won't hear what he's saying, right? They'll think he's just showing off. So he performs both ways. Particularly interesting that Hori Babu, we're told by Kipling, has the spying, which you might think is the greatest goal in life, to be a Babu, to be in the civil service, and even better to be in the secret civil service, should be the greatest goal for any loyal Oriental in Kipling's world. But no, Hori Babu really, this is his day job. What he really likes to do is go around the country with the excuse of being a spy so as to become an ethnographer. He loves to study the different customs of India's regions, and he's taking notes, as here. I have taken notes. And it is the dream to become a Fellow of the Royal Society of England by contributing scientific papers on Indian customs, because thanks to his day job as a spy, he gets to learn. So we have a fascinating inversion, and if you're reading it in a deconstructive or sort of suspicious way, which is also a way to read it, you would say, well, you see, anthropology, ethnography serves empire, right? The discipline did, but Kipling has reversed reality for his purposes, and here the imperial game serves Hori Babu as his scholarly interest. It's the day job by which he gets to go around the country, learning about these native customs, writing them up for the Royal Society. And he becomes a friend of the spy master, their boss, who's got Colonel Creighton, who also has the wish to become a Fellow of the Royal Society and sends in papers, hoping one day and they bond over this. Now, in Kipling, there remains, of course, it's still kind of patronizing towards Hori Babu. The assumption is that Colonel Creighton maybe has one chance in 100 of becoming a Fellow of the Royal Society, like various other civil servants who did that. Hori Babu has no chance to become a Fellow of the Royal Society, and we know that. Even Colonel Creighton sort of knows that, but he admires the impulse, and he knows his own chances are small anyway. So there's a limit, there's a glass ceiling, but nonetheless, it's an extraordinary thing for Kipling to have imagined Hori Babu having this imagination and turning the imperial game to his own sort of scholarly purposes. In this respect, it's too limited to see that the character Kim is the sole projection of Kipling onto the scene. Equally, Hori Babu is a version of Kipling. He's someone who is performing himself, who is the ethnographer of the society, writes the notes on all these customs. What other thing is Kim itself? Then in fact, you could say the Great Game plot is the excuse for Kipling to tell us all about all these different groups that he gets to explore all around India, including the Lama who comes down from Tibet, the whole sort of thing. That's much of the fascination for Kipling, and much of Kipling's success right globally is not just indeed that he writes good sort of adventure stories, but that he gives all this, free new color of India, of this imperial world, this adventure that we can all enter into imaginatively. And the plot is almost just like the day job for the actual experience of one scene after another. So as much Hori Babu as Kim is Kipling's own projection. Now, what's really interesting to come to the present is that Hori Babu reappears in a recent novel by the Tibetan postmodernist Jamyang Norbu. Now, if you did not know that there are Tibetan postmodernists, this is the new landscape in which we find ourselves. And even in the plural, the other best-known Tibetan postmodernist is Ganang Tashi Dawa, who writes in Chinese. Norbu writes in English. He's mostly a Tibetan activist, and he's written on Tibetan culture and politics a lot. He has a collection called Shadow Tibet, for example. But he wrote one novel called The Mandala of Sherlock Holmes. And in this novel, he decides to tell the story of what happened after Sherlock Holmes supposedly fell off the Reichenbach Falls after wrestling with Dr. Moriarty, which is the scene you see on the cover. And when Conan Doyle brought Sherlock Holmes back to life 2 years later and started doing more Sherlock Holmes stories, he has Sherlock Holmes explain to Watson what happened during the interval. And he says, well, they went to Tibet and had some recent conversations with the Great Lama. So Jamyang Norbu decides to tell the story of those missing years. And there's a detective story, which Sherlock solves and so on. And it becomes an allegory of using this old British literature to think about the struggle of Tibet for independence from China, the modern concern that Jamyang Norbu has. Now, for Sherlock, Watson isn't there, because we know that Watson wasn't there from the later Sherlock Holmes stories. So Norbu needs a Watson figure. And who does he pick but Harichandra Mukherjee? So Harichandra Mukherjee meets Sherlock Holmes in Bombay and then accompanies him up to Tibet and he tells the story. And you have a very interesting set of episodes involved in this, of the story. The story becomes a worldwide success. And so what Norbu has done very strategically is to use global English and the global popularity both of Dickens, of Conan Doyle and of Kipling, and of the detective story to reach a worldwide audience. So it gets translated in many, many languages, and here we have it in Hungarian, Vietnamese, just within a few years of its publication in 1999, becomes a global work building on this global background. And in the process, it even becomes a global work differently in different countries. So the original Mandala of Sherlock Holmes is seen on the left. They published in India, where it won a prize. It then soon gets published the same year, next year, in England and America. Apparently, the American press did not believe that Americans would know what a mandala was, and they decided to play up the Sherlock Holmes part. So instead of calling it the Mandala of Sherlock Holmes, they called Sherlock Holmes the Missing Years. Then the British publication decides to have it both ways. They call it the Mandala of Sherlock Holmes, The Missing Years. The Missing Years is not in the original title, there's no subtitle. These days in the United States it's brought out in the version I showed you first, the last one here on the right, the Mandala of Sherlock Holmes, in which they decided that the Sherlock Holmes fan club is not a big enough audience. So they go instead for a postmodern metafictional audience, which you can see with the illustration, because the illustration does not actually show Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty in the Reichenbach Falls. It is a picture by an American artist from 10 years ago, which shows Paul Demade wrestling with Jacques Derrida in the guise of Holmes and Moriarty. What looked like cliffs are in fact streams of words. It's an entirely textualized universe. Very interesting. Now, in the course of then, Norbu uses Kipling's own success as a global writer to go global himself across a network of global English and beyond. And what's particularly interesting to me is that Hori Babu is not a problematic character for Norbu. He has a lot of fun with him, but in a different way. We're going to get back to K-Maro. We'll get to K-Maro. I thought I had still another quote, but I don't there from Norbu. What Norbu does, he describes how global. He has a preface in his own name, in which he describes how he found this manuscript written by Harichandra Mukherjee about the adventures of Sherlock Holmes. But this autobiographical preface, which is accurately autobiographical, he talks about coming down as a refugee into Dharamsala from Tibet after the invasion. He was still a boy, his family moves down. It says, my life there was at first a lonely one, but on learning the English language I soon made many friends, and best of all discovered books. Like generations of other schoolboys, I read the works of G.A. Henty, John Bucher, Rider Haggard, and thoroughly enjoyed them. Yet nothing could quite equal the tremendous thrill of reading Kipling or Conan Doyle, especially the latter Sherlock Holmes adventures. Now he's saying with a straight face that the most obnoxious imperial writers, Henty and Rider Haggard, mixing in with Kipling and Conan Doyle. But for Norbu, the British adventure in India was not his struggle. For him, it's a way out of the box of being in this small Tibetan refugee community, sort of marginalized in northern India. English becomes a way into the world as a boy already, and then very much in the novel. And it's quite amusing because he has it's a very affectionate parody of Kipling and of Conan Doyle simultaneously, which he can then mobilize against the Chinese invasion of Tibet. And he has a lot of fun with Harichandra Mukherjee, who tries to then ingratiate himself with Sherlock Holmes in disguise in the way he did in Kim successfully with the Russians and the French guy. When Sherlock Holmes arrives in Bombay, Mukherjee is sent to try to figure out who this mysterious Norwegian is. He's in disguise, and he disguises himself, posing as a shipping agent's guide. Satyanarayana Satai, failed entrance Allahabad University, introducing himself. But Holmes isn't fooled. The first thing he says to him is, "You have been in Afghanistan, I perceive." This is quite brilliant because this is actually the first thing that Holmes says to Dr. Watson when they meet in the first story. Watson had been an army doctor in Afghanistan and was sent home on disability afterwards. This causes Mukherjee to burst into a kind of hyper-Babu speak. He's so discomforted that his disguise has been seen through. He said, "Oh, I am most humble Hindu from Oud, presently with limited gainful employment in demi-official position of agent pro tem to respectable shipping firm. Afghanistan. Wasabi, lands wretched, cold, devoid of essential facilities and civilized amenities. Natives, all murdering savages, Muslims of worst sort, beyond redemption and majesty of British law. My word of Afghanistan." "Why indeed," said he, "but a rather sinister look." So the thing about Sherlock Holmes, which is quite fascinating, he's not fooled in the least by this, even by this kind of hyper-Babu, racist, anti-Muslim thing that Purdy goes into when his cover has been blown, because Sherlock Holmes is the one person who is not a racist. He sees what he sees. He doesn't see a stereotype, right? He never sees a stereotype. He sees what's in front of him. And he sees the person in front of him has been in Afghanistan, it's not a shipping agent from Bombay. You can see, 10 things about him instantly, right? So he doesn't have racial presuppositions at all. And he doesn't look down on anybody. He just looks at them. In the process of this, what Norbu does is he pulls out of Kim exactly what Indian readers have so much trouble seeing, which is this performative aspect, this already globalized self-awareness that Kipling has projected into Hurry Mukherjee as one who's performing his Indianness for the foreigner. And for all of the irony with which, the sort of affectionate irony with which Norbu treats this now performative Richard Mukherjee, he actually rights the wrongs of history by making, we're told on the title page of the novel, a Fellow of the Royal Society. He actually succeeds, he receives the Founder's Medal, he's also a Fellow of various learned societies in Calcutta, and also a corresponding member of the corresponding British Russian Scientific Society. So he is bringing together, he's building bridges across these cultures all together. So Norbu's novel not only undercuts Orientalist preconceptions with Hurry Mukherjee, he also then has a whole plot going on up into northern India when they get there, in which it turns out, not to go avoid too much of the plot, that Sherlock Holmes himself is a reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, from which he brings out, and he uses his mystical powers to defeat the Chinese ambassador in Lhasa. And Norbu builds on this with a remarkable number of quotes pulled direct from Conan Doyle, which reveals Sherlock Holmes' spiritualist side, which is there. He's full of a sense of the emptiness of life, transience, that's why Vijay is doing cocaine, ephemerality, and Conan Doyle himself was interested in spiritualism. And this whole element that's underneath, and there's part of the piquancy of the rationalist Sherlock Holmes, Norbu totally gets, comes it up. Whereas Richard Mukherjee is the modern, enlightened scientific man, doesn't believe all this Tibetan mumbo jumbo. Turns out that Sherlock Holmes connects to it perfectly. So there's a wonderful kind of circular trade around this. Playing all throughout with a kind of sovereign freedom on global English, both the language and the literary heritage, going back to Kipling and Conan Doyle. Using this affectionate parody of Kiplingese, mobilized to draw in foreign readers around the world to a deeper understanding of the cultural and political struggles of Tibet for recognition and independence. And he has a creative hybridization of English never better seen than an extensive glossary that concludes the novel. It's a kind of combination of the linguistic hijinks of Lestat Stroin and the sort of auto-ethnography you see, for example, at the end of Chinua Achebe's, the glossary of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, or long glossary of Igbo terms. Norbu has a 10-page glossary that sets Tibetan, Hindi, Sanskrit, and English terms on an even plane, even using French to elevate the Hindi term derived from Arabic bakshish, which he glosses as an alms, a pourboire. The glossary teaches us that dekchis are Hindi cooking pots, a chilling pot is a foreigner in Tibetan, a kafila is a caravan in Arabic, a lingam is a phallic symbol in Sanskrit, and my favorite definition, an Anglo-Indian term, a poodle faker, is a womanizer. I think that that the only case I know of poodle faking in literature is in The Good Soldier Schweik by Hašek, in which we have someone who takes ordinary dogs and dyes their hair and cuts their hair to look like poodles and resells them to society ladies. That's a poodle faker, I believe. So there was a whole profession of poodle faking 100 years ago. And he has this sort of worldwide success with his riotous pastiche of imperial English, and found his way into all these other languages as well. Banned in Tibet, and actually out of print in India, Norval's novel has brought the Tibetan struggle to a worldwide audience through this use of global English. So those are my kind of prime examples, but I thought I would also close by going beyond literature proper to the wider media sphere, both in terms of English and in terms of popular culture. Nowhere, I mean, Kipling is one thing, but another order of magnitude has been the spread of hip-hop from American culture worldwide. It's in this remarkable history over the last 20 or 25 years. It's kind of invasive form, you could say. And here are two other questions. Well, is this now the end of civilization as we know it, the leveling out of global culture? And the answer would be yes and no. It is. And particularly the problem I think when you're dealing with really contemporary stuff is that most of contemporary hip-hop music is total crap. But then again, most Petrarchan sonnets were total crap in the 16th century, right? We remember the few that have survived the centuries. The survival Franco Moretti calls the slaughterhouse of literature. The few hip-hop artists who will be remembered 200 years from now, are 2 out of 10,000. We don't yet know who those are. Though part of the fun of working on contemporary stuff is you try to identify the people who seem actually interesting, among a large number rather less so. And even of the interesting people, which are the works of most interest among a mixed production. K-Maro is one such figure. When I first encountered, I got interested a little bit in this hip-hop, not because I had been interested in hip-hop, but from the multilingual aspect. A lot of hip-hop being produced in different parts of the world mixes languages. And often some English, but often various other languages. And I first heard about this when my middle kid was studying Japanese in high school. And I heard her listening to actually it was a Hawaiian hip-hop group of Japanese descent that mixed Japanese and English. And I'd never known there was such a thing. So I got interested. And started to get puzzled by these things that are mixing 2 or 3 languages, thinking of what on earth is really going on. K-Maro being one of those ones that I found was interesting. And let me just, in very brief, I don't want to take too much time. I, as a comparatist, I found it very hard to deal with one of these things by itself. But what helped me to understand this kind of weird mix was comparing K-Maro with an even stranger mix to me, which was one of the artists of my daughter was Nami Amuro, the queen of hip-hop, Japanese artist. And her text looked like this. And I don't know any Japanese, and this mixture is so peculiar. And I thought, what on earth are these people doing with this stuff? And what I realized was that Nami Amuro, learning more about her, helped me understand K-Maro. Because she began her career, she was discovered in Okinawa at age 15 and put into a band called Super Monkeys. She was the middle one, this group of 5, a very bad sort of bubblegum rock, really terrible songs, at least to my view. And then what happens is that young recording women stars in Japan have a very short shelf life. It's a male-dominated industry that the young and cute, and then they're thrown aside. By the time she was reaching her early 20s, she fired her producer and reinvented herself as a hip-hop figure, and a kind of a very uncanny multiple figure between the Pink Panther and the kind of S&M kind of thing, multiple identities and so on. And she used the American idiom as a way out of the box, that as a young girl from the provinces in the Tokyo music industry, she could become what they were not. She could be more transgressive, more American, more global than the quite insular, in every sense, Japanese music industry. So for her, the global hip-hop is not, the American hip-hop idiom is not unlike Kipling was for Norbu and coming into northern India. And I realized that so it gets her out of the sort of box of gender and provinciality. I won't take the time to go go into it, but she mixes these things, and she kind of takes control over the industry. She became recently. This is actually interesting. The sort of control she takes, she becomes her own producer in effect, and the sort of guider of her own career. She recently became the only Japanese pop singer ever to have a million-selling album in 3 decades of her life. She's now in her 30s. Quite extraordinary. And this extends to her fans. So if you go on this is a fan site on a fan site called Corey's J-Pop Lyric. These are hyperlinks. So if you want to know the dictionary definition of the technical term coochie, you click on it and it'll give you a dictionary definition, which I won't describe here. If you click on Trojan, it gives you an ad for condoms, thereby enabling the fan base to perform the control over the sexual encounter that their heroine sings about. So it extends out into real life. Now, Nami Amuro helped me think about K-Maro, and I realized that she is doing with gender and provinciality what he is doing with race and ethnicity. So K-Maro also reinvents himself as a double figure, as you see. He is both. So his family leaves Lebanon during the Civil War. They moved to the Parisian banlieue, where he first discovered his music as a young teenager. They then hop over to Montreal, where he starts a music career. And for him, I think already in Paris, and certainly by the time in Montreal, the hip-hop idiom becomes a way out of the box of being this Lebanese immigrant in the French-speaking country. He could never be French enough, but he can be more American, he can be more ghetto, it can relate to his own experience, so he starts to have this career. And in the same process, by being successful, he can be more French than the French, right? More American and more French than the Canadians. He can somehow do it both. He can go, because he is European, he's cosmopolitan, right? So he's out of the box of being in Montreal in both directions. And actually, La Good Life album, from which Wada Balada comes, on the back of it is another version of this picture. The double self will appear sometimes on the same album. So I was realizing that for him, the American idiom serves in a way that's comparable to Nami Amuro, not on the gender issues at all. In fact, he's quite sexist and obnoxious on the gender issues. That's not his issue. It's not his, I would say, his creativity life, but very differently here. So let me just play you maybe this song, Wada Baladi, and what you'll hear, just as a sort of closing bit here, you'll hear the instrumentation brings in Middle Eastern instruments a bit and rhythms within the hip hop idiom. You'll see, so he's the son of the son of my country, I take it. And here he is, if you come, whether you come from here or from far away, we're all gone by the same route. You guys are mixing in slang, English, slang, and they're gangster. Viens pas me jouer les gangsters, gangster rap. Well, I found me, it's not necessary. You get this stuff coming in. You get really street slang of French, and you get this refrain. I'm the son of my country. Sing loud if you understand me, right? And it's sort of music unites the races. He says, we get rid of these taboos. And in my head, I've never left. I am always here. And the present tense and EC are very interesting. Does EC mean Montreal? Does it mean Beirut? Does it mean New York, where his producer is? He thanks friends on 3 continents in his liner notes. Is the EC just the space of the performance itself, right? Where he's united with us, past, present. So all this is quite, I think, moving, kind of a statement of identity and poetical principles, and connected to the audience, and hoping to make a fortune and make a way into his life, and connect and build these bridges across cultures. So I'll just close by playing you this this song. You can see how it sounds to you.
Hey,
So that made the general effect. And just in conclusion, I would say what we learned from this is that we need both a global comparative literature and a comparative English literature. Thinking about global English means thinking about English's multiple uses and the extraordinary kind of creativity with which serious artists, whatever their perspective and whatever their particular mustache, are using to transform global English for local purposes around the world. Thank you. Sure. Questions? Is there a microphone? Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for your really fascinating talk. I just want to ask, I think in some ways what you gave us was perhaps an example of different types of, if you like, comparative English literature, or English comparative literature, or global literature, if you like. But would you suggest there's one methodology that we should adopt to do such comparative literature?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and a complicated one these days, because I think the field is in such flux, which I think it's the most interesting time to do comparative study for the last 75 years. But probably the most interesting time since about the 1880s, when people really started to work this originally. Because for such a long time, comparative study, there were various methods used, but there was such a commonality of subject matter that it sort of dampened or seemed to ease the methodological issues. I mean, you might be a deconstructionist, you might be a historicist, but everyone knew that if you're a comparativist, you had a really good accent in French and German, right? That's what it actually meant to be a comparativist, French, German, and English. And beyond that, that sort of provided a kind of, I remember this one Swiss comparativist, Werner Friedrich, in 1960, said, well, we were already at that point in the United States courses in world literature. He said, well, they're really false advertising because we should really call them NATO literatures because that's all we teach. But then we only teach 1/4 of the NATO nations anyway, so that would be too much. So now that we're thinking more globally, including about even just English literature, right? At least when I was in school, the last real refuge of colonial imperialism in the United States was the subordinate status of American literature. British studies, with a subaltern to the hegemonic British in the United States, where we could do it. Now if we have an English literature that is really multi-continental, let alone if we have a world literature, if we have Arabic literatures of many regions, if we have all sorts of less commonly read literatures like Tibetan or Dutch coming into the discussion, then the methodology becomes sort of a heightened issue because it's not masked by the commonality of the few writers we study. Partly because you can no longer assume that the writers know each other. Right? And that was always a kind of a glue. So whether you were a deconstructionist looking at Proust's rewriting of Baudelaire, or whether you were a romanticist looking at Tennyson's rewriting of Wordsworth, you had rewriting, you had a conversation going on. So to me now our methodologies must have to become more flexible and varied, and it becomes more of a question of choosing the method that suits the problem and shaping a problem that suits. And I think that's actually important. Too often I think the method brain to the extent that people impose a method on a problem too often. Why we're working on it and how we're working on it. And so we have to have a conversation internally as well as with our colleagues about that. So in some cases, so we have a classic comparative literature in which Noble has read Kipling and Cunninville very closely. That is that's standard complet, standard literary studies. I don't know that Nami has listened to K-Maro or vice versa. Certainly they have a lot of common people who listen to it and who could do a genealogy like that, but just for my purpose, I need to go to that prior level. Just seeing what they're doing becomes a comparison across languages and cultures that there's not a direct link, except an intermediary through English.
I'm not sure I've formulated a question yet, but I'm thinking about it. When you were talking about the monstrous hybridism that you mentioned earlier, I'm sure you must have read the article by Salman Rushdie in the New Yorker several years ago, in which he talked about modern Indian literature and said...
It's an infamous article, yes.
Is it? Yeah.
Yes.
And just for those who haven't read it, he said in it that the best literature being written in India is not the local languages, but in English. And he said that English was being transformed in this way. And I'm wondering, because many people in this part of the world, as I'm sure you know, write in English and face some of the problems that you demonstrated with Kipling already, but of course in a different way. So I'm wondering, what do you think? I mean, what do you think is the future of English writing in other parts of the world, where people are trained in English, even trained in English literature, and then have to overcome many problems as they're writing? Political problems, problems of getting published, stuff that you've written about yourself in the piece that you're going to be discussing tomorrow, I've read it, and so on. So I wonder if you have anything to say on that issue.
Yes. I do believe that it's a very interesting period, and it's a very creative period for this use, these interactions of English and other languages. I guess we always live in the best of times and the worst of times. It's certainly easy to and important to be aware of the balances of power, the unevennesses of translation, the survival of reading markets, of publishers. I mean, that are serious issues. Along with this, though, I also think that writers who are able to use English now have quite a variety of ways they can use the English, including just making it as a transit medium. I mean, one of the work on it and comparatively with is Orhan Pamuk, fluent in English, but not perfectly fluent in English. He would not choose to write in English. He writes always in Turkish, but he supervises line by line, checks the English translation. He knows that half of his translation will be done through English, because there are not that many speakers who speak Vietnamese, for example. So he cares a lot about translation, because a lot of the world will reach that way. So there's an interesting case of someone who has, and that allows him to make sure he's happy with the translation, writing English. At the same time, we know so many writers in a second or third language that, whether it's in from Kenya, and I was just reading a memoir by Gugi, the interpreter, which is about his experience growing up in a attending English language high school in Kenya, which was a colonial, still in colonial Kenya, and very much about acculturation and and he has written about how he ended up not wanting to write novels in English. He went back to because he felt it was liberating and free. But at the same time, he talks about how important English literature was, and that the very history that were being given to him and his classmates to kind of make them good inspired his friends towards their revolutionary work. To make them realize they did not have to accept the status quo. It's superb, and he can write, and it has written beautifully also in English. These days, for the writer who wishes to English to actually write in it, whether it's in a Nabokov or a Watiango, it provides a direct access to a global market that locally, depending on the size of the literary and the audience, and even otherwise, it still becomes, if they can connect to it, just as French was to an extent, but English now even more, to reach audiences around.
What's that with consciously like K-Maro? Simply because of the Anis speaks English. This is the language. What you do between like him,
That's right. I think that what artists will do is take the that are sort of unconscious in the culture and then they make conscious use. So I think that for Cyril Kumar, who comes to Paris with this cosmopolitan background, it's that the Parisians don't, and he realizes that, and then he uses it very strategically. Right? So the difference between the three, they're mixing in whatever, kind of a mix. He is making a choice of idiom. And also, if you're going, if you listen to TV, about a third of the words are English now, in the Hindi broadcast. That's a kind of a mixture, which is also just a hybridism that produced English, right? Yeah, and in the songs too. And sometimes English, Hindi, and 2 or 3 other languages as well. So I think that the K-Maro is raising to conscious this resource from growing up in Lebanon, absolutely.
And where actually is it that some of the logical considerations or non-considerations that you've talked about intervene?
Well, the limits in what sense?
The limits as in the examples that you gave, at least the K-Maro, okay, and basically text. Here what we have is really about the uses of English. It's the uses of English within the context of reception, as opposed to a more probably formal, like grounding in intertextuality for the novels. This kind of thinking actually about methodology, how is it with the nature of the being basically compared or worded basically?
Well, I think that the limits aspects. One of the things I think about the limits of comparability is what are the limits of us to really free ourselves from perspective to begin with, and to avoid simply projecting some new version of our own, pre-existing there's a danger of just, again, of a happy little multiculturalism in the case of an American like myself, a Disney-fied world that we not so much this, that we sort of pride ourselves in recognizing, whereas the difference we recognize is really just our own liberal multiculturalism all over again. This is all the more an issue with worlding when we pay close attention to the fabric of language, so that the teaching of literature in English translation or teaching of world literatures in Arabic translation. I mean, on one hand, you have to, in my view, or you lose literature, but you have to do it with an intense awareness of the limits of foreignness once you've got it into your own, already domesticated, inevitably, even if you're trying to represent the foreign. So that, to me, a lot of the challenge of comparability is keeping a lot of difference and resisting our own will to power over the language, which is as much an issue of methodology as it is of cultural difference. If we have a certain way of approaching things, all of us will, or are we just going to, and the comparison becomes an artificial one, which we're finding it getting our presuppositions confirm. So that seems to be a real issue. On the other hand, these texts are always susceptible of more than one method of comparison. If we wanted to do an intertextual relation with the hip-hop, then we would do it. There are plenty of hip-hop artists who are each other intertextually all the time, or intervocalically, intermusically. And you get these, even in terms of circulation, often quite aware. So there's now, West African music, for example. So what does that come from? Ethiopian and musical idioms transmitted to the Caribbean, about morally marketed through the United States, and specified form, and then marketed back to West Africa. Really extraordinary sequence, which is comparable to, let us say, that the spread of stories of Kala from the Indian Panchatantra, right, to the Arab, then goes then comes down into Africa, then becomes African slaves in the south of the United States. Has local agreements, right? Probably no readers of Harris knew they were reading Panchatantra stories that come to Kala through West Africa, through the south. But that's those kinds of already global circulation, and these methodological questions are challenges at any time when we're looking at the two works from distant times and places. So we have to raise the consciousness, the limitation, I think, of the radical foreignness, but are difficult in keeping the foreignness there. And let me just say about a footnote to that. One of my big concerns is that in comparative study, literature study, there's a great deal of presentism. We have a lot of serious, committed people who reject various sex and classisms, but are totally unself-conscious about contemporary literature. So much work in comparative studies, work written since 1960 or so. That's the last % of the history of literary production, right? And foreignness or comparability, for readers today, let's say, contemporary novels written in Egypt and Japan and the United States are more similar to each other than any of them is to Spencer or to, the poetry of the West. The real comparability questions to me are with anything before 1900 and anything since.
Thanks, David. My Australian is a bit rusty, so I'll ask my question in English. The answer that you just gave is interesting because you start to look at reception and literature from the point of view of markets, while your talk focused on point of view and consciousness about writing for a world audience. I wonder if you could talk about you see both of these as necessary and sufficient for a conceptual literature. Is Steak like world literature? is J.K. Rowling?
What was the last thing?
Is Steve Larson or J.K. Rowling world literature? And at what point did they become world literature?
So I'm going to say yes. To me, as a whole, very much involves reception as well as creation. Any given study may be more on one side or the other, but is equally about both. And in that sense, even talking about his reception of Kipling and Conan Doyle as a child, but then creation. So even for him, we can say both are explicitly there. This question of popular literature that you're raising with Steve or J.K. Rowling is really interesting. And that's been a sort of shadow of world literature since the time of Goethe, when he was first formulating his promoting it, which has been recently formulated by others. He's afraid that popular literature is swamping the real literature, which is masterpieces written by Shakespeare and himself and his friends, Shelley and so. That's world literature. Those great towering things, and he's worried about this. That's the same worry in the preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballad. It says, even I almost said the works of Shakespeare are under a flood of sickly and stupid German tragedy and French novels in verse. I hope he didn't mean tragedy. It's very sickly and stupid, presumably not. So this weirdness in the academic and even Goethe rightly understanding world literature as elite is. And then there's this popular literature. Right now, I'm working on a collection with a Swedish and Belgian friend on Theodan, being the Belgian detective novel as world literature. And we're looking at this to see now what does this mean? There is, in fact, a whole worldly circulation of these never talked about by literary scholars. Steve Larson or below their radar screen of those. So I think that is also a question that, is K-Maro world music like world literature or like world cinema, or is this so below that it doesn't even deserve? And one time when I was included this in a comparative literature to a department in the US, which is very much in the high theory mode, and I said, did anyone ever think, sometimes ask me if I was just selling out? I thought a very elegant way of, she wasn't asking me if I was, she was asking me if someone asked me if I was selling out. So it's kind of a question. That was only all the more sort of insulting in its own way, but nonetheless. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So that is the definition of methodology, right? In fact, I think that world literature should not include the whole group of texts, and I think verbal narratives that circulates. Among other things, literary scholars, we tend to be 100 years behind where the culture is. We are viewing film and popular culture rather the way classicists were viewing, in the mid-19th century, well, you can read that on your own. Like it, but we should be studying Aeschylus and Statius. And I think that's a retrograde view that is unfortunate. So I would like to see, not that we are abandoning, Proust and Alvin, but that we are seeing these great works within the wider cultural landscape that they exist in. And the circulation of world literature should anything that circulates around the world, which therefore means J.K. Rowling, is a work of world literature. Even as we can see that there are greater works and lesser works on all kinds of scales of value, I will still take Shakespeare or Proust over J.K. Rowling.
Well, we have to close off. Any other? It's okay. Well.
And that's a question.
Again, thank you so much for the talk. I don't know if it's sold out well, if it is. My
Sell out crowd is a good thing, right? If the audience theater sold out, that's good, right?
Right, you're going to sell well. My question has to do with, it's actually Prince Carlin joke in which he talks about people talking about whether they're going to go out for Chinese or Thai or Italian. Goes, what? Why don't people ever go, I'm going out for Irish? Is that the extent to which the domestication within the United States and Britain to some extent, or in the United States, the becoming white, as it were, obscures the extent to which the critical of the Irish in decentering English was really straightforward. That by the Irish, right beside this empire, independence in the way that they did, provided a model for him, and one could go through the litany from Shaw. Alien was coming to mind as you were, speaking to Kipling, etc. To what extent might this have something to do with the fact that Americans don't know that they're an empire? If you talk constantly, like, it's fine, you can say it, imperialism, but endlessly, like, empire, being an empire, being an empire. If you say this to Americans, well, they're really stunned by the news, and somehow this multiculturalism, otherness of the world can't possibly be white or, the Italian Americans have become, there's not like Italian American literature or Jewish American literature or Irish American literature anymore. It's sort of like subsumed by white. So I just wonder the extent to which that obscures the key role of the Irish in this decentering modern period.
It's not some impressive. His hero can be Irish, Anglo-Irish. He's well aware of this thing. I mean, there's a couple of different aspects about what you're touching on. One is the melting pot worked for the United States to a considerable extent, right? So its Irishness is the same way that it did 100 years ago. It's certainly registered. Not the way it did in England 200 years ago, where the Irish were called black, represented as being Africans virtually often in cartoons. So to that extent, I guess the Irish case is a bit of a success. And at the same time, kind of Americanized towards British political history, understandably, in terms of academia, I did an anthology of British literature years ago before I did the world one, and there was this reigning world British literature. And one of the things that made me do the other anthologies, something to do they didn't already do, they had a literary map of England in their end papers, and they had writers, Anglo-Irish writers, Wilde and Yeats and so on, well represented, but they left Ireland off the map. On the other hand, they had Wales on the map, but so I thought we could do a little bit better about this. Help make Americans think, all right, Ireland's actually a place. It's a place. The British Isles is a multicultural space. And if you're going to talk about, it's not just the march from Anglo-Saxon in the anthology also, for example, Marie de France had never considered translated before, even though she made her whole career in London. She writes on Arthurian themes, but she wrote in Anglo-Norman Saxon, so she's been treated as a wholly owned subsidiary of French. So her name means Marie from France. Troy would ever be named that, right? Marie d'Orléans, Marie de France, we don't have that name. And just the other footnote, my colleague at Harvard, Stephen Bowen, is a comparatist, has an article about world poetry. Too often world poetry is treated like the sessions in a shopping mall in the United States. And you have one of each of your culturally defined others. Chinese restaurant, you can have the Middle Eastern restaurant, you can have the restaurant. But he says, there's no Chinese restaurant. And he says, there's Szechuan food, it's so that this otherness, the Middle Eastern food, but there would not, recognize. So in a certain sense, we don't go out for Irish because the cuisine has been sufficiently absorbed, There's not a distinctive recognition of Irish food. That cultural otherness is so stylized, something that we as scholars scholars, I think, have a lot of responsibility against it in every possible way. And thinking of the period of culturalism leaves out so much cultural information is something we have to worry